Welcome back. India and Pakistan have confirmed aerial assaults as both continue with retaliatory action after heavy cross-border fire yesterday that reportedly killed at least 45 people. India says air defense systems neutralized Pakistan's attempts to strike military targets with drones and missiles hours after Islamabad claimed it had downed 25 drones. Now, Pakistani authorities are reportedly recovering debris across several areas. The army says 4 soldiers were wounded in Lahore after an intercepted drone damaged a military site, while 1 civilian was killed in Sindh province. Pakistan calls the assault a serious provocation, adding air forces are on a high state of alert and vigilance.
Last night, that is the night of 7th and 8th May, India has undertaken yet another blatant military act of aggression against Pakistan by sending Harap drones at multiple locations.
New Delhi has accused Islamabad of stepping up the intensity of unprovoked firing along the highly militarized border in Kashmir. But it says it remains committed to non-escalation if that is also respected by the Pakistani military. Now, Pakistan has vowed retaliation for yesterday's missile strikes by India that killed 31 civilians. New Delhi, in turn, reiterated its right to respond following the deadly shooting in Pahalgam, Kashmir, last month. Pakistan has denied any involvement and called for an independent investigation into the 22nd of April attack.
Our response was targeted and measured. It is not our intention to escalate the situation. However, if there are military attacks on us, there should be no doubt that it will be met with a very, very firm response.
Analysts are optimistic that the India-Pakistan conflict won't dent Singapore's trade relations with the two countries. Let's look at some of the trade figures Singapore has with India and Pakistan. Now, we start with merchandise import numbers from India to Singapore. According to the Department of Statistics, Singapore imports from India in 2024 was 11.68 billion Singapore dollars. Now, in 2020, that figure was $7.14 billion. Here's a breakdown of those top imports from India. The Observatory of Economic Complexity stats show that in 2023, these were refined petroleum, jewelry, raw zinc, gas turbines, and chemicals. For Pakistan, Singapore's imports in 2024 was just over 330 million Sing dollars. That's about 3 times the figure of $103 million back in 2020. As for imports from Pakistan in 2023, the top 5 were refined and crude petroleum, gas turbines, alcohol, and suits. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Pushan Dutt, Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD. Professor Dutt, thank you so much for joining us this evening. For a start, in what instances might Singapore be affected by the ongoing conflict, especially if the situation persists or worsens?
Well, I think we have to think a little bit about the likely scenarios. And the most likely scenario is that the situation will de-escalate and both of the nations will step back. Now, why is that the likely scenario? It's because, all the major powers, whether that's US or Russia or China or the EU, are actually pushing for a de-escalation, because rightfully the world gets very nervous when there is even a small-fledged conflict between 2 nuclear powers. So therefore, that's the most likely scenario. Yes, we can think of other scenarios where, this becomes a full-fledged military conflict, in which case that would have a bigger impact on countries in this region. But keep in mind that India is not a large trading powerhouse like China. So India does not export a lot, India does not import a lot. So therefore, whatever impact we see is likely to be muted. And as a result, I think Singapore will also be quite resilient, even if things deteriorate quite rapidly.
Okay, Professor Dutt, but this conflict is also taking place in the middle of US tariffs and geopolitical uncertainty around the world. So to what extent do you see this conflict impacting Singapore's cost of living in the short term or even in the long term?
So globally, inflation has been coming down for the last year and a half or so. So we have to think of Singapore's particular circumstances. So Singapore is something that economists call is a small open economy. So it exports a lot and it imports a lot, which means that whenever there are shocks to its trading partners, it can actually propagate into Singapore in the forms of changes in prices. But the size of the trading partner really matters. So, and Singapore's biggest trading partners are the US, the European Union, China, Malaysia, etc. India is only the 10th largest trading partner of Singapore, and the Singapore's exports are about 3%, and India accounts for about 3% of its imports. So, therefore, overall, we should not see a big spike in inflation even in the short term. Second, it's important to keep in mind that, it's actually the Monetary Authority of Singapore which has a much bigger impact on inflation. So even if there is an inflationary spike, the MAS will use its monetary tools, which is by adjusting the nominal exchange rate against a basket of currency. So they're going to appreciate the Singapore dollar and therefore bring down inflation. So for both these reasons, I think that the impact will be small, short-lived. Yes, there might be certain commodities where we might see a spike, like rice or jewelry or things like that, but not an overall large impact on inflation.
But beyond our shores, do you see an impact on the larger ASEAN region?
So the only way is to think about what this will have is it sort of adds to the uncertainty in this region, right? So, and keep in mind that whether it's Singapore or the ASEAN countries as a whole, they are very, very much embedded inside the US-China trade conflict. So what's happening within US and China, the tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs, that will have a far greater impact on these economies than what's happening in India. In fact, paradoxically, what might happen is that some of these ASEAN countries could actually benefit. So if we think about that electronics exports from India sort of slows down, and that leads to a price spike, then Vietnam is a large exporter and producer of electronics. Similarly, if rice prices spike, Thailand will benefit because it's actually a large exporter of rice. But at the same time, I still think that overall the impact is going to mainly come from the US-China conflict than the India-Pakistan conflict.
All right, Professor Dutt, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us tonight. That was Professor Pushan Dutt, Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD. Thank you.